Our discussion today deals with probably one of the worst calamities that has hit the British Islands, certainly, and or generally Western Europe in the last 200 years. Now, um, obviously there are the episodes of the Holocaust during World War II, the Armenian genocide during World War I. And there are obviously events that are really awful, calculated murders, and that can't be avoided. Those topics need to be discussed in their rightful place as well. The other piece to this, though, is the Irish potato famine. The Irish potato famine is a human tragedy as well, just like the other two that I've mentioned and others that I have not yet mentioned. But these also deal with another situation, right? Those are calculated situations where people really tried to annihilate a group of people. For the Irish potato famine, that's not necessarily the case. There was no calculation, it was really just sort of prejudice and racism that guided principles to correct these situations, and they simply avoided it. So, we're going to be talking today about that, and obviously, this event is a hugely significant event in global history, but it's also obviously a piece of Victorian history because it happens from 1845 until 1857. Now, the potato blight, the potato famine, is caused by a fungal infection. There is an infestation that comes to Ireland and subsequently other places that uh, devastates the potato crop. Now, at the time, there was no cause of the understanding. There was no cause of no understanding of what was happening. Right? There was no idea of what was bringing this down upon people, and a lot of people blamed it on heaven or other issues that people in the 19th century blamed it on. Now, a couple things to bring out here, right? Number one, it starts in the United States. The first place where this fungus hits is in the United States, and it happens in 1844, a year before it arrives in Ireland. Second, it doesn't only affect Ireland. It affects Ireland, but it also affects the United States, as I've mentioned, Scotland, France, Belgium, the Low Countries. So it affects other parts of Europe as well. But the effect of this is extremely devastating to Ireland. Now it arrives in Scotland in 1846 in the Highlands, but the Scots were not necessarily as dependent upon the potato in the same way that the Irish were. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Just to compare the two, in Ireland, something about 3 million people are on the verge of starvation by 1847-48. Now, in Ireland, the famine lasts much longer than it does in Scotland, and that's largely due to the fact that people in Ireland devote their whole attention really to the potato. And we'll talk about why that is in just a second. The relief here is really not provided by local groups because it's such a devastating event that people just can't afford to support their neighbors, and it winds up being a real calamity. In Scotland, again, another part of Britain, so it is worth mentioning here, only about 200,000 people are on the verge of starvation. Now, in terms of gross population, that's looking at around 1/6 of the population, whereas in Ireland, you're talking about nearly 45% of the population. So roughly, let's call it 15% in Scotland to 45 or so in Ireland. Quite a big difference. Now, the relief in Scotland is much more local, just like it is in Ireland. But in Scotland, because potato was a sort of, let's call it a secondary product, the need for really global, let's call it relief, doesn't really happen in the same way. So Scotland is a bit quicker on the bounce back than Ireland will ultimately be. So let's talk then about Ireland and the potato. One of the big things about Ireland is that Ireland's population from the late 18th century into the 19th century really explodes in a way that the UK in general, Britain and Scotland, don't experience. And that's largely because of the potato. Potatoes are per acre can sustain a family much easier than pretty much any other product. Potatoes can Potatoes are very high in calories and carbohydrates. That one potato can provide a person with nearly 200 calories. So Irish, the Irish are surviving. Many Irish are surviving on really exclusively potatoes. So about 3 million people are really living on it entirely. The average person, or the average poor person, I should say, is eating about 2 kilograms of potatoes a day. So to put that into reference, 2 kilograms of potatoes is about 4.5 pounds of potatoes. So if you go to the store and you buy yourself a 5 pound bag of potatoes, that's what the average person is eating per day. So that's a huge amount of potatoes. And they're not supplementing it with much, right? There might be some sort of cream if you have a cow on the farm, or there might be an egg if you have a chicken. But really exclusively, the poor are really eating potatoes. Now, I should also point out here that Ireland, just like Scotland to the north of England, are living under the realm of sort of British imperialism. And the Irish are living under a system where landlords, largely absentee landlords who live in either England or southern Scotland, are owning the property that they are farming, but they are not around. So they don't necessarily have their full attention into the scheme of the property, and they are sort of insulated from these effects. And then there's also sort of tenants below them and other landlords. So it's a huge bureaucratic mess. And now Ireland has lived under this for about 200 years by the mid 1800s, maybe even 300 years in certain closer to Dublin. And there's really sort of a need to really help develop, let's call it, civilized Ireland. So there's really not a focus on sort of helping the Irish. There's also another piece to this. Ireland and all of the UK is governed by something called the Corn Laws. Now, corn in this situation doesn't mean the yellow corn that we eat in the summer, but corn in this case really means any grain. So there are the Corn Laws. So there are a series of laws that are passed throughout British history, really in the 18th century and then the early 19th century, that are meant to protect British grain producers. And they are tariffs essentially on grain from outside France, basically anywhere outside the UK, France, the Netherlands, and obviously the United States. Second, the other piece of this is just sort of generally 1 million people during 1 million households, so up to maybe 5 million people if you're talking about a family of 5, are living on what are called potato wages, that they're basically getting paid in potato, or they are paying in potato, right? There's this idea that there's sort of tendency on potato. So then the blight hits. 1844, there are 15 million tons of potato being produced in Ireland. 1 year later, that drops by 30%, going down to 10 million pounds. 10 million tons. And then by 2 years later, down to 2 million tons. Now, when you think about the number of people who are relying on this food source for their daily sustenance, you're talking about a huge reduction in the amount of food that is circulating around Ireland. Starvation and the diseases associated with it run rampant throughout Ireland. People die in huge numbers because of certain diseases like typhus, just general fever, and dropsy, which is basically a lack of energy in your body and sort of illnesses that come along with it. This causes a couple of major things. Number one, it causes what we call the clearances, where landlords trying to sort of at least hold on to their rent ideas clear people off, basically kick people off the property, saying if you can't pay, get off. Now, obviously, that's immoral, kicking people out of their homes, but it also just shows sort of the arrogance of this, right? And again, many of these people are British, English, Scottish landlords who are living in, either Scotland or in England, and they are, obviously, uh, just not caring about the people who are on their land. So it's not locally owned. But also because a lot of these people are English, it's just really showing the sort of callousness of the English. The other piece to this is many people just sort of up and leave their homes, right? They can't pay their rent, they can't pay their debts, and they move to towns because, well, maybe there's a job in a market or a factory that I can get. So this is really a troubling time for the people of Ireland, and certainly for the government. So finally, in 1846, the British government, the larger government of the United Kingdom, decides to respond. The prime minister at this point is a guy named Robert Peel. So Sir Robert Peel is a conservative. He's a Tory who very much believed in not interfering in the market. And indeed, another part to that, he also believed that poverty was, and I talked about this in an earlier lecture, poverty was a deficiency in a person. You weren't impoverished because of circumstances of social or economic problems, but rather you were poor because of moral collapses and moral failures. So improving yourself would get you out of poverty. Now, obviously, we know that's not the case. Because of that, he doesn't do anything to really change the sort of local situation, right? The landlord problem, or just getting food to the people necessarily. But instead what he does is he does sort of small, sort of sneaky things. One thing that he does is he has a secret shipment of 100,000 pounds worth of corn shipped from the United States into corn. Now this is real yellow corn, not just grain, shipped into Ireland. Really just sold at cost, really just meant to try and fund, or really just to give people some sustenance. Second, he tries to repeal the corn laws. Now, those are the corn laws, the grain laws that are setting up tariffs. However, that at first is a failure, ultimately succeeds later. The other thing is he sets up sort of a dual system where landlords and local economy was supposed to support the funding for relief and donations. Now, if that sounds ridiculous in the middle of a famine and an economic crisis, it should, right? No one has the money to really supply this, right? Because if you can't grow potatoes that are the basis of your economy, and you can't pay your rent, those people don't have money. The people can't pay rent above, they don't have money. So what you're basically saying is, no one's got money, but everybody's got to donate. Doesn't work. So Peel ultimately winds up getting kicked out of government. He's replaced by a guy named Sir John Russell. Now he's a Whig, so a different political party. Now, as a part of his economics, he believes in laissez-faire economics. Now, this basically means government should be hands-off, right? Don't get involved in what's going on. The market will figure it out. Now, this is a terrible idea as well, because what this basically says is the government doesn't care about you. The people who are in charge don't care about you. What we're going to do instead is just wait to see how this all where the chips fall where as they may. And obviously not a good idea. These different policies, really hurt the Irish, right? Because at least in some way in 21st century America or Europe, right, we believe that, if one political party doesn't have our backs, the other will figure something out. Here, basically, you have two political parties who have two different philosophies of how not to help the poor people. Peel comes back into power after John Russell is after the Whigs sort of lose their way as well, and he starts a policy of public works where basically the government pays workers to build roads. The only problem was, in order to prevent sort of overuse and sort of useless money spending, They basically insulate the money so well that it takes weeks to get to the people who need it. They're so impoverished that the workers are sleeping on the roads in sort of tents or just sleeping bags. It's really an awful situation. In Scotland, the situation is a little bit different. There are different religious organizations that can get involved, but again, this is a different situation because Scotland is not necessarily as badly hit as the Irish are, and because you have sort of different churches within Scotland, the Presbyterian, the Catholics, and the Anglicans. There's a really sort of good sort of Venn diagram almost of who is covering who. So you have less of a real economic travesty in Scotland, and you also have a situation where you have sort of different religious groups that are taking on the task of paying for poor relief. Finally, 1847 really seems to be the worst year of the potato famine. By 1847, as I said earlier, you have something to the tune of 2 million tons of potatoes being produced, which is, 1/7 or so of what was previously produced only 3 years before. Money is also drying up. One of the things that had happened is global recognition of this calamity in Ireland is getting globally recognized. So money is flowing in from Ireland, New Zealand, Canada, the United States. African Americans who are enslaved and have pennies to their name are donating to the Irish because of the trouble that they are experiencing. So money is flowing in 1845 and 6. By 1847, that money really dries up. And money from Parliament is also sort of getting to the point where the government doesn't have much money to spend, especially in the 1800s, before we have the gross taxation we have today. So Black 47 is really known as the worst part of it, where millions of people are just really flooding the coasts and getting on the first ship. They don't even care where the ship is going to, whether it's France or Netherlands, whether it's Australia or Canada or the United States. They don't care where they're going. Just as a part of local history, New York history, it's important to notice also that the United States, New York City, receives a lot of Irish during this period as well. For those who know of St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, Irish immigrants come to the United States, come to New York, obviously, and when they come to New York, they start investing and donating to the Catholic organization here because a lot of them are Catholic. And they are donating, and ultimately the cathedral here in New York City is named after their patron saint from Ireland, St. Patrick. Moving on. 1850 is really when sort of the plateau comes. And although it's not until really 1857 when we start having normal years again, 1850 is really sort of the end of the worst part of it. By this point, there's sort of a stabilization, largely, and this is an idea called Malthusian ideas, right, from a guy named Thomas Malthus. There's sort of an equilibrium where if you have too many people, not enough food, too many people, not enough food, ultimately there will be a balance. So about 4 million people leave Ireland or die from starvation and other illnesses. Another 4.5 remain in Ireland, and food starts to stabilize. Now, it doesn't mean that everything's done, doesn't mean that the infestation is gone, but what it does mean is that people can start eating more normally. And that ultimately brings the end to at least the hardest portions. Thank you.